For most of the century since the Old and New Testaments were composed, the readers have not been able to understand them in the original languages in which they were written. This has placed a heavy burden on the many translations into which they have been rendered over the centuries, especially considering how often those readers have regarded the Bible as a sacred text, whose very words came either from God or from people he had inspired to write what they did. So how have the translators of the last 2,000 years and more dealt with the challenge of rendering these texts, which were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, into something that people from a wide range of languages and cultures could understand? The first translations of the Bible predate the composition of the New Testament itself. This was the Septuagint, which began to be composed around the 3rd century BCE in Ptolemaic Egypt. Egypt, and in particular the city of Alexandria, was at the time a center of the Hellenistic culture that had spread across the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia after Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the later 4th century. That's why all of our Hellenistic Jewish literature is written in Greek and uses Greek literary forms. Even the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who wrote essays on many of the themes he saw in the Hebrew Bible, may have worked entirely in Greek. We really don't know how many Greek-speaking Jews would have been able to read the Bible in the original Hebrew. But the story that the Jewish historian Josephus tells us about the origins of the Septuagint, that it was commissioned by one of the Greek kings of Egypt so that he could add Jewish wisdom to the famous library of Alexandria, suggests that the Jewish community of his time was reluctant to acknowledge that it made this translation for its own needs, because its members could no longer read Hebrew. After all, we know from the literature they wrote, much of which became part of the biblical Apocrypha, that they were very proud of their Jewish identity and culture. As we saw in a previous lecture, the Septuagint placed more emphasis on conveying a good Greek style than on staying very close to the literal meaning of the Hebrew text, which is full of expressions and idioms that don't exist in Greek. But it was followed later on by other more literal versions which tried to do just that. Another important early translation of the Hebrew Bible is the Aramaic version known as the Targum. Jews began speaking Aramaic once their country was incorporated into the Persian Empire in the 6th century BCE, and while we don't know how soon it became the spoken language of the land of Israel, we do have papyri written in Aramaic in the 5th century by a Jewish community that lived on Elephantine Island in Egypt. The Targumim began as simultaneous oral translations of the Hebrew text when the Torah was read in public. These translations were spontaneous and would have differed from one to another, but some of them were eventually written down. The most popular written Targum is attributed to a man called Onkelos in Jewish tradition. This translation, which now appears in standard editions of the Hebrew Pentateuch, is not entirely literal. It incorporates midrashim, or interpretations that have developed to explain difficult passages or Hebrew idioms. For example, in Exodus chapter 4, it translates the phrase, Uvenei Israel yatzu biyad ramah, the children of Israel went out with a high hand, as the children of Israel went out openly. It also incorporates aspects of Jewish law. At Exodus 23:19, where the Hebrew has Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, you shall not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, it has instead, you shall not eat meat with milk, which was the standard legal interpretation of this passage. The Targum also consistently reinterprets the many phrases in the Hebrew Bible that describe God in human terms, such as having a physical body or expressing human emotions. At Exodus 33:20, for example, the phrase, you will not be able to see my face, is rendered as, you will not be able to see the face of my presence, using the word Shekhinah, which was coined by the rabbis to describe God's presence in the world. It also translates God as the Word of God in passages where he has a physical presence, as in the story in Genesis where Adam and Eve hear him walking in the Garden of Eden. The Targum also modernizes the place names used in the Bible to reflect what they were called when it was written. The next major translation included both the Old and New Testaments. This was the Latin Vulgate, or Common Translation, which was made by the scholar Jerome in the 4th century CE. There had already been a number of Latin translations of parts of the Bible, but this was the first complete version. Some books, like the Apocrypha, had already been rendered into Latin from the Greek of the Septuagint, while Jerome translated the Hebrew Bible himself from the original language. He also translated the Greek New Testament. Though the text of the Vulgate has been reworked over the centuries, it has remained the standard in Catholic churches, and translations of the Catholic Bible have mostly been based on it rather than on the original texts. In addition to the Vulgate, there were also ancient translations into languages such as Ethiopian, Armenian, Georgian, and Syriac, as the church spread north and west from its sources in the eastern Mediterranean. In medieval Europe, on the other hand, there don't seem to have been many attempts to translate the Bible into the local languages, considering how central it was to European religious life. At first, in the centuries after the Western Roman Empire fell around 500 CE, everyone spoke a form of Latin. But in time, early forms of Italian, French, and Spanish began to emerge. And since Latin remained the standard language of Catholic worship, it was increasingly difficult for congregations to understand the prayers and Bible readings that were part of their church services. At the same time, very few Europeans knew how to read in any language. This was a problem even for members of the clergy, as we know from an initiative launched in the court of the Emperor Charlemagne. He and his head of education, an English scholar named Alcuin, felt that the men who led Catholic communities did not have the necessary education to fulfill their tasks, and even priests did not know enough Latin to read the Bible. So Alcuin set up schools where priests would study Latin so that they could teach the Bible to their congregants. This included learning how to read and write, which was also a skill that only applied to Latin, since at the time the Romance languages were limited to songs and oral poetry. While Alcuin's schools improved the Latin used by priests by bringing it closer to its classical form, this may have made it harder for their congregations, who had never studied it, to understand what they were hearing in church. The relationship between Catholic congregations and their priests and bishops was often a point of contention during the Middle Ages. The social organization of churches and synagogues meant that to one degree or another, the members of congregations had a passive relationship to those who were leading the service. But in medieval Europe, this relationship was challenged when Christian groups like the Cathars and Waldensians, whom the church considered heretical, rejected the clergy's monopoly over church worship, including reading from the Bible. The Waldensians in particular were known for letting their lay members preach in public and for rejecting the attempts of local bishops to limit what they could say. This led to a letter written by Pope Innocent III in 1199 to a French bishop, in which he tells him to forbid his community from reading translations of the Bible, which they had commissioned because they couldn't read Latin. Truly, our venerable brother, the Bishop of Metz, has signified to us the multitude of laymen and women, drawn in no small way by desire, have had the Scriptures, Gospels, the Pauline epistles, and many other books translated for their own use into the French language, exerting themselves towards this kind of translation so willingly, but not so prudently, that in secret meetings the laymen and women dare to discuss such matters between themselves and to preach to each other. When any of the parish priests wished to censure them concerning these matters, they stood firm before them, trying to argue from the Scriptures that they should not be prohibited in any way from doing these things. The mysteries of the sacraments of faith should not be explained everywhere to everyone, since they cannot be understood everywhere by everyone, but only to those who can conceive of them by their faithful intellect. A group similar to the Waldensians was the movement called the Lollards, which was active in late 14th century England. This community also challenged the privileges of the priesthood. Unlike the Protestants of later centuries, they were in favor of subordinating the church to secular government. Instead of priests, they favored traveling preachers who were not appointed by the religious authorities, and they believed that everyone should read the Bible for themselves. To that end, they tried to distribute copies of English translations, but their efforts were limited because each one still had to be copied by hand. Their ideological leader was John Wycliffe, who wrote a number of essays in which he criticized the power and the wealth of church officials. He may also have been the author of an English Bible, which was popular at the time, and after his death, the government passed a law requiring any future translations to be authorized by the state, as the King James Bible would be in 1611. The creation of the King James and of the modern Bible in general was closely tied to the invention of mechanical printing in the mid-15th century. By the end of that century, there were presses in 200 European cities, and Venice alone had over 400 printers. Starting with the Gutenberg Bible around 1455, the Vulgate, which was the Bible of Catholic Europe, was published in both Latin and several European languages during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. But around that same time, Western Europe became mired in years of ideological and military conflict in the upheaval now known as the Protestant Reformation. Churches across Northern and Central Europe broke away from the authority of Rome and made radical changes in their practice of Christianity, such as rejecting the authority of the priesthood in favor of a communal leadership under the guidance of ministers who were chosen by their communities. This emphasis on independent communities meant that parishioners would be encouraged to read and interpret the Bible for themselves, which they could only do in their own languages. And now that printed books were becoming widely available, people could learn to read the Bible and many other books in the same language they spoke. This meant, of course, that they would have to learn how to read, and beginning around 1500, literacy rates in Europe slowly began to rise, though they would not approach modern levels until the establishment of state education systems in the 19th century. Even if they couldn't read, they could hear the Bible read to them as before, but the establishment of national Protestant churches independent of Rome meant that those readings, and the service in general, would now be conducted in the languages of each country, and the entire congregation would be invited to sing along. Protestants also believed strongly in returning to what they considered the pure original form of Christianity, including its scriptures, which were written in Greek and Hebrew. Universities like Oxford and Cambridge now had professors of Hebrew and other Semitic languages, and classical Greek had recently been introduced to Europe, encouraged by the large number of Byzantine Greeks who had fled there after the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople in 1453. As a result, the Greek text of the New Testament now became available in a corrected edition based on old Byzantine manuscripts, which was published in 1516 by the Dutch scholar Erasmus. The first and the most influential of the Bibles translated by and for Protestant communities was commissioned by Martin Luther, the German minister who was one of the pioneers of the new movement. Luther was not a scholar of languages, and some of his work was based on the Latin Vulgate, which he knew from his time as a priest. But unlike earlier translators, who tended to stick very close to the literal wording of the Latin, Luther wrote in a more natural German style. He also worked with scholars of Greek and Hebrew so that his work would be more faithful to the original texts. Like the works of Shakespeare in English, Luther's Bible helped to shape the style of modern German prose. The rise of English Bible translations, starting in the 16th century, was closely tied to the establishment of the Church of England. All of the English translations of this period trace their roots to the work of William Tyndale, who was a scholar and an essayist of the early 16th century. He was an admirer of Luther, who rejected priestly control over the interpretation of the biblical text and believed in governmental control of the church. He also wrote many essays which were sharply critical of ecclesiastical authority, and like the Lollards, he wanted to democratize the practice of Christianity. Tyndale's views were reflected in his translation, as when he rendered the Greek ecclesia as congregation rather than church, as earlier translations had done. This was controversial because it implied that all the members of a church were equally important, and so was Tyndale's choice of elder rather than priest for the Greek term presbyteros. Though presbyteros is the origin of the English word priest, it does mean elder, which appealed to Tyndale's belief that the church should be run by laymen. He also wrote notes and introductions to his work in which he set out his views. Tyndale left England and was declared a heretic, and he was finally executed in 1536, and his translations and notes were banned. He was still working on his Bible when this happened, but the English editions that followed relied heavily on his work and completed what he had not finished. Tyndale's work was mainly completed by the translator Miles Coverdale, who published in 1535 the first complete printed English Bible. This was a combination of Tyndale's Pentateuch and New Testament and his own translation of other books, which was based mainly on Luther's German. His completed Bible then became the basis for several others, including the Great Bible, 1535, the Bishop's Bible, 1568, and the King James Version of 1611. But the most popular option at the time for the average reader was the Geneva Bible. This was published in Switzerland in 1560 by English Protestants who had fled there after Queen Mary temporarily restored the authority of the Catholic Church in England. It too was based on Tyndale's work, and as a Protestant Bible, it completed that work on the basis of the original languages rather than the Vulgate. It also included lengthy notes, which reflected Puritan and Calvinist doctrines. This made it more radical than other Protestant translations of the time. But it was also more affordable than the Bishop's Bible, which was so called because it was a large and expensive edition printed for use in churches. The Geneva's smaller size also made it more convenient for individual families. Around the same time, a Bible was produced specifically for English Catholics. This was the Douay Bible, which was published in the 16th to 17th centuries by Catholics who had fled to France after Elizabeth I, who succeeded Mary, once again severed the Church's ties with Rome and made Anglican worship compulsory. Like most other Catholic Bibles, the Douay was translated from the Vulgate, which was considered more theologically correct than the Greek New Testament. It also took the original languages into account. For example, it included definite articles where the Greek text did, even though these are entirely absent in Latin. On the other hand, it sometimes translated the Latin as literally as possible, which made the English harder to read. As the Douay's translators told their readers, "We presume not in hard places to modify the speeches or phrases, but religiously keep them word for word and point for point, for fear of missing or restraining the sense of the Holy Ghost to our fantasy," acknowledging with St. Jerome that in other writings it is enough to give in translation sense for sense, but that in scriptures, lest we miss the sense, we must keep the very words. The Douay Bible also avoided interpreting passages that were difficult to understand in themselves, because the editors felt that it was the job of a community's priest to explain such things to the congregation, so that people must read them with license of their spiritual superior, as in former times they were in like sort limited. Such also of the laity, as were permitted to read Holy Scriptures, did not presume to interpret hard places, but leaving the discussion thereof to the more learned. In other words, any passages that were theologically difficult had to be explained by the priest rather than the congregation. But even so, the Douay, like its predecessors, also relied on the work of the Protestant William Tyndale. The last in this series of English Bibles was the King James Version. Like its predecessors, it was based on the work of Tyndale and Coverdale. According to the title page of the 1611 edition, it was translated out of the original tongues and with the former translations diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's special commandment. As one of the most important expressions of the Church of England's ideology, the KJV was careful to avoid what the Anglican establishment saw as the excesses of other Protestant churches. Its editors decided not to include any notes in order to distance it from the Geneva Bible, which King James disliked because it criticized the power of kings. They also rejected the Geneva's preference for lay leaders over bishops, whom the Church of England had decided to retain as religious officials, and avoided Calvinist terms like elder. Though it took several decades, the KJV finally became the source of the biblical texts included in the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Even though it's primarily based on Tyndale's original translations from Greek and Hebrew, the KJV sometimes sounds more like the Latin of the Vulgate than previous English Bibles because, like John Milton's Paradise Lost, it prefers English words derived from Latin. If we compare it with the Geneva Bible, for example, we find the following. At Ecclesiastes 1:17, the Geneva has, "And I gave mine heart to know wisdom and knowledge, madness and foolishness. I knew also that this is a vexation of the spirit." While the KJV has, "And I have given my heart to know prudence and learning and errors and folly. And I have perceived that in these also there was labor and vexation of spirit." In this passage, the KJV contains several words that are borrowed directly from the Vulgate text. And in another passage, Job chapter 2, verse 9, not only do we find this same Latin style, but the Hebrew word barech, which literally means bless, but is used in the Bible as a euphemism for curse, is even so translated literally by the KJV, while the Geneva renders it as blaspheme. The rise of Protestantism took place around the same time as the Age of Exploration, when Europeans began to visit parts of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. In the centuries that followed, they established an often exploitative economic and political presence, which is now known as colonialism. Alongside merchants and soldiers, there were missionaries who traveled from the colonial powers of Europe to places like India and the New World to educate their inhabitants in Christian beliefs and practice. And as many of them were Protestants, they emphasized the importance of reading the Bible, which meant, as in Europe, that individuals needed to own copies of the book in a language that they could understand. To that end, they translated and printed the Bible in the languages of the communities where they had settled. And since some of the local languages had never been written down before, it was necessary to invent new alphabets for them and to teach their speakers how to read and write. As the text from which these translations were made was the English of the KJV, their translations often reflected its style. And just as the KJV came to be seen as no less authoritative and sacred than the original text, these new translations acquired the same status. One of these missionaries was John Eliot, an English Puritan living in New England who translated the Bible into the local Massachusetts language and had it printed in English characters. Another English Baptist, William Carey, lived in Bengal in India, where he produced Bible translations in a number of languages, including Bengali, Hindi, and Sanskrit. He was also a student of classical Indian literature and translated the Hindu epic Ramayana into English. Finally, we see the first modern translations of the Bible beginning in the 20th century. These differ from earlier ones in both the cultural values they're meant to reflect and the scholarship that lies behind the choices they make. For example, the Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version, which succeeded it, based their translations of the New Testament not on the Byzantine manuscripts, which Erasmus had used because they were the best sources available to him, but on the Nest Aland edition of the Greek text, which had been produced at the beginning of the 20th century and was based on earlier manuscripts from the 4th century CE. Another modern translation, the Jewish Publication Society, has been published in two different editions. The first, from 1917, was based on the Revised Standard Version, but made changes which better reflected the Jewish Masoretic text, as well as Jewish interpretations of verses that in the past had been mistranslated for the sake of a Christian theological agenda. A completely new version was published in 1985, which was produced by a team of Jewish scholars and was based entirely on the Masoretic text. Any of the Bible translations of the last several decades have also tried to chart a course between respecting the literal meaning of the text and making it clearer to the modern reader. A number of Bibles have simply modernized the language of the KJV, whereas others, like the New International Version, represent a compromise in style between the literalism of the KJV and the language of contemporary English. Still others, like the New English Bible, the Living Bible, and the Message, use varying amounts of paraphrase to give what they believe is a sense of passages as modern speakers would express it today. There have also been attempts, in the New Revised Standard Version, for example, to use more gender-neutral language in passages that did not refer specifically to men, even though they had traditionally been translated that way. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, for example, instead of the phrase, "man does not live on bread alone," the NRSV has, "one does not live by bread alone." In our next installment, we'll look at the history of Bible interpretation from ancient times through the modern era, whether we should read the text literally or in other ways, and how the way we understand it is affected by the age and the culture in which we find ourselves. Please remember to like and subscribe.